Welcome to session 6 of the Gospel of the Kingdom of God, the Allegiance to the King foundational class. Tonight's session, I've titled How to Practice Righteousness. It'll become pretty quickly obvious why I titled it that. But first, let's do a recap. Where have we been? Session 1, the gospel is the kingdom of God. That means the rule and reign of God, which exists both now among God's people and in the future will fill the earth. So that's the gospel. In session 2, we saw that Adam and Eve, and subsequently everybody else, has violated the commandment to not reject God's authority for their own. So that's what the knowledge of good and evil was all about. And that sin of rejecting God's authority for my own is what brought about death. The good news is that God has made a way to overcome that problem of death by returning to his authority. And in session 3, we learned that how that occurs, of returning to his authority, comes through covenants, and that the new covenant, as the Bible calls it, is the final covenant God is offering to mankind, and he's offering it to all mankind in order to return to his authority. And we saw that the man, Jesus of Nazareth, is the promised messianic king who initiated and oversees the new covenant. And then in session 4, we saw that the Sermon on the Mount is a good place to find the terms of the new covenant, and that the sermon follows the pattern of the old covenant, the Mosaic covenant, with its 3 sections. And then last time in session 5, we saw that kingdom people are consistently characterized on both the inside and outside by relying on God, by recognizing the destructiveness of sin, by gentle kindness that is helpful to those in need. They're characterized by craving to do what God is expecting from them, by showing loyalty through compassion and mercy, by being honest and having integrity from the heart, prioritizing God above everything else, and by actively promoting peace in every situation, and by being willing to suffer persecution for being a kingdom person. And then we also saw that the covenant is an implementation of God's law. It's not the law itself. So the Mosaic covenant is not, at its core, is not God's law. It's not the thing that God is truly expecting in general from every one of us. It's an implementation of that thing. And the various covenants are various implementations of God's laws, including the new covenant. And then finally, Jesus shows us by examples that the way to fulfill the commandments is by doing them from the heart itself. The kingdom people will go to great lengths to live out God's commands, sacrificing in order to love and serve others. Okay, so in this session, in session 6, first part, we're going to look at, we're looking at Matthew chapter 6, and we're going to see overall the structure of Matthew 6 and how it's talking about how to practice your righteousness. Then in part 2, we'll dig down into the first half of Matthew 6, looking at practicing righteousness for reward, hopefully from God. And then the latter part of Matthew chapter 6, practicing righteousness for provision. And I'll explain those terms as we get to them. So let's get into the first part here, how to practice your righteousness. So let's do an overview of Matthew chapter 6. I want to start in verse 1. This sort of introduces the whole thing. It says, "Take care not to practice your righteousness in the sight of people, to be noticed by them." Now you'll notice it doesn't say that you should never do your righteousness in front of people. Sometimes you absolutely have to. But you don't want to do it to be noticed by them. Otherwise, you have no reward with your Father who is in heaven. Right? In the first section that we'll go through, Jesus is going to give us 3 examples of what he's talking about. And these 3 examples involve reward. And they are, the first one is giving to the poor, the second is prayer, and the third is fasting. And then the second section is practicing righteousness for provision. Now, the difference between rewards and provision is in rewards, it's I'm doing something looking to be rewarded by God for this thing that I'm doing. Provision is what I need to live life, right? I need food and shelter and clothing, those kinds of things, love. In order to be a healthy, happy human being and be helpful to other people, I need a certain level of provision in my life, right? So the problem is, just like other things that God gave us that's good, we can abuse them, we can misuse them, and that kind of thing. And so this gets into that aspect. So the first is going to talk about storing up provisions. This is the storing up treasures. Somebody's got their thing unmuted. Storing up provisions, and then it's going to go into a section on greed. And I'm going to give away the thing. It's the middle part, talking about, if your eye is full of light or if your eye is bad, it's talking about greed. And then the final section is talking about worrying about provisions, right? So he's going to give us some lessons about all this. So kind of going over this idea of practicing righteousness. Reward means recompense for work done. Provision means material things needed for life. And so Jesus is going to challenge us to think about where these things are coming from. Our rewards, our sufficiency for life, where are those things coming from? And he's challenging us, are they coming from God? Are they coming from, in the case of rewards, am I looking to get rewarded by other people? In the case of provisions, am I working towards making sure that I'm providing enough for myself and beyond, and all that kind of stuff? Where's that stuff coming from? Each of the examples, the 6 examples that he's going to give and talk about, I'm going to tie them back to the commandments, the kingdom character traits that we saw in the Beatitudes. And it's not comprehensive, the ones that I'll briefly talk about. It's just to give you the idea to kind of see that all these examples that he's giving us are really tied in what it means to be a kingdom person, those characteristics. And then we want to ask ourselves, in each of these cases, are we being self-focused, that what I like calling self-centeredness, or are we being self-sacrificing, right? And thinking about how we're practicing these things, these righteousness things and life things, which of these characterizes how we are about that. And then it's important to remember that we're in the rulings or practical example section, and that all of this is intended to teach us how to live under the reign and rule of God. These are not laws like the characteristics are. These are examples to teach us and help us to get it, to understand what it is that Jesus is getting at. It doesn't mean, for instance, that when he gives the Lord's Prayer that, well, that's the way you should pray. You should always pray that way. You should always pray the Lord's Prayer. That's the way you pray, right? That would be misunderstanding the nature of the rulings section. Okay, so a quick part 1 review. Matthew 6 is divided into 2 sections. First section is instructions about rewards for spiritual or activities or righteous practices. The second section is about our attitudes regarding provisions for life. And finally, these examples are intended to teach us how to be kingdom people, how to live out the kingdom characteristics, those commandments. And we'll pick it up in part 2 next.